So, guys, ever since Christian Parker took over as the Cowboys defensive coordinator, one thing has become crystal clear. We're going to see a massive breakout. And look, this defense isn't just getting new players, it's getting a completely different identity. Every report coming out of OTAs and minicamp has hinted that Parker is building something very different from what we've seen in Dallas over the last few years. But the interesting part is, most fans are only seeing the surface. Now, NFL analyst John Owning just broke down one specific part of Parker's system that explains why this defense could look completely different once the season begins. And when you understand what he revealed, you'll start to see why so many people inside the Cowboys community are excited about what this coaching staff is building. What's up, Cowboys Nation? Welcome to the NFL Playbook Cowboys. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So, what John Owning revealed starts with a buzzword that came straight out of Christian Parker's first press conference as defensive coordinator. He said this defense would play a base 3-4, but with 4-3 spacing. On paper, that sounds technical, but once you see how it plays out on the field, it changes everything about how this front is going to attack offenses this season. It's not just a scheme label either. It's a complete philosophy shift for how this Cowboys front seven is going to operate on every single snap, from the first practice of training camp all the way through the regular season. So, here's the difference. In a traditional 3-4, you'll usually see the three interior linemen lined up head up on the offensive lineman. That's a two-gapping alignment. The player puts both hands into the chest plate, keeps his eyes up, and reacts to where the running back goes before picking a gap to attack. It's patient, it's disciplined, and it's designed to control both gaps around a blocker at once, but it can also be slow if the defender can't process the play fast enough. That's always been the trade-off with true two-gap fronts. You get control, but you sacrifice some quickness off the ball. What Parker is installing is something called gap and a half. It looks similar to two-gapping on the surface, but the technique underneath is completely different. Instead of squaring up and throwing both hands into the chest, the defensive lineman plays on an edge. One hand goes into the chest, the other hand grabs around the shoulder pad. That half-man relationship changes the whole rhythm of the rush. In a normal two-gap look, the lineman plays with his hips down and his head up, mirroring the blocker to stay square to both gaps. In the gap and a half scheme, because the alignment is already on an edge, the lineman can fire off the ball much faster. If he gets a clean first step, he just keeps going. If the blocker gets hands on him, he resets the line and holds his ground in his primary gap instead of getting driven backward, all while still maintaining that edge instead of squaring back up. Now, the interesting thing is that lineman stays in his primary gap unless the ball crosses his face. Once it does, you get what's called a shrug shed, where instead of shedding to the side, the lineman sheds all the way through and slides into the adjacent gap, what they call the secondary gap. The whole point of doing this is to build what John Owning called a vice around the ball carrier. Every interior defensive lineman is shedding toward the gap closest to the runner's actual destination, collapsing the space around him instead of just guessing pre-snap and hoping the numbers work out. And that's a direct answer to a problem this defense had last year. Instead of relying on numbers, stacking the box with 8 defenders just to have enough bodies near the football, Parker is trying to solve the run game with technique and size up front. Last year's approach was basically throwing numbers at the problem. This year, Parker is throwing big bodies and technique at it instead. That's a real shift in philosophy, and honestly, it says a lot about how this staff evaluates talent versus how the previous regime did things. The linebackers behind this front changed too. In a pure one-gap system, linebackers have to shoot their gap immediately, no hesitation. Any delay and offensive linemen get into their bodies, which opens seams for the run game. That was a real issue last season with Kenneth Murray, who struggled to diagnose plays quickly enough to fully use his athletic tools. All that speed and physical ability, but the reaction time just wasn't there consistently, and that slow trigger created problems all year long. In Parker's scheme, linebackers play what's called stack fits. Instead of firing downhill right away, they sugar over their gap, take a step or two, and read before committing. Once the running back declares, they scrape over just like the linemen in front of them, creating layers of defenders converging on the same point at the same time, adding numbers right where the ball is actually going instead of where it might go. The result should be fewer splash plays behind the line of scrimmage, but a lot more of what's called run stuffs, tackles that hold the runner under 3 yards. You might see fewer highlight reel tackles for loss, but you should also see far fewer explosive runs breaking through untouched. For a defense that gave up too many chunk plays on the ground last year, that trade-off is exactly what this staff is looking for. It's a calculated sacrifice. Less flash for a whole lot more consistency. And if you ask me, that's the right trade-off to make after the run defense issues we saw last season. Okay, now let's talk personnel, because this is where John Owning's breakdown got specific. Up front, you've got Quinnen Williams at the 3 technique, Kenny Clark at nose tackle, and Otito Ogbonnia at the 5 technique. What stands out is how much these 3 overlap in size and skill set. It would not be surprising to see Quinnen Williams slide over to nose on certain downs, or Otito Ogbonnia bump inside while Kenny Clark shifts out wide. All 3 have the frame and the strength to moonlight at each other's spots, especially on rundowns where size matters more than pure quickness off the edge. So, here's something worth watching closely once the training camp opens. We don't know yet if Parker is going to align this front by left and right, or by strong side and weak side. In a left-right system, a player like Quinnen Williams would always line up on the same side of the field no matter which way the formation is strong. Always the left side 3 technique or 5 technique depending on the call. In a strong weak system, that same player would always be the weak side technique regardless of field side, meaning he could bounce between left and right depending on where the formation's strength is set. This detail might sound small, but it tells you a lot about how the staff wants to simplify or complicate reads for these linemen. And we probably won't get real clarity until beat reporters start tracking alignments in camp and preseason, or possibly not until the games actually start counting. And it's not just the front 7 that Parker's been vocal about. He's made it clear that stopping the run and affecting the quarterback are the 2 priorities that actually decide games. He's said it himself. When you're strong on fundamentals, getting off blocks, tackling, attacking the football, that's what turns 3rd and 2s into 3rd and longs, and that's when quarterbacks start making mistakes. That ties directly back into everything John Owning broke down. The gap and a half technique isn't just a fun scheme wrinkle, it's the mechanism Parker is using to actually deliver on that first down philosophy. And there's a bigger reason to care about all this. Analysts around the league have already pointed out that if Parker can just get this defense to league average, the Cowboys' offense is good enough to win the NFC East on its own. That's the ceiling here. Not a complete overhaul overnight, but a defense that stops beating itself, and gap and a half is step 1 in making that happen. Then there's the edge, and this is where the wide alignment conversation becomes important. Donovan Ezeruwaku lining up as the weak side edge benefits massively from playing outside instead of tight to the tackle. Think about the angle to the quarterback. If you're aligned tight, you have to work up and around the tackle, then bend back to the pocket. That's a long, difficult path that eats up time and burns rush lanes before you even get close to the quarterback. Widen that alignment out, and the angle flattens completely. Speed becomes a real weapon because you're not immediately colliding with the tackle. You get room to work stutter steps, jab moves, whatever setup footwork you want before committing to a bull rush, a speed rush, or a swipe move around the edge. That extra space is exactly what allows an edge rusher to manipulate a tackle's pass set instead of just surviving contact. And it's a sharp contrast to what we've seen happen when edge defenders are stuck in tight alignments, forced to win with power instead of finesse, which almost always favors bigger, more physical rushers over athletic, twitchy ones who thrive with room to operate. A guy who wins with finesse and manipulation just doesn't get the same chance to shine when he's boxed into a tight alignment against the tackle every single snap. Once training camp actually gets underway, the real test is how quickly these techniques get installed across the roster. Gap and a half is not a simple concept to teach. It requires linemen to change footwork, hand placement, and get off habits that might be completely different from what they've played for years in a different scheme. The linebackers have to learn timing on their scrape technique so they're not late to the ball, but also not overrunning their gap discipline and blowing the whole fit. And the front alignment rules, whether it ends up being left, right, or strong, weak, will shape how naturally these players react once the season actually starts and the reps come at full speed, without time to think through every assignment. But based on what John Owning broke down, the intent is obvious. Christian Parker wants to stop guessing with numbers and start winning with technique. If the interior 3 can hold up in that gap and a half look, and the linebackers scrape on time, This defense has a real shot at fixing the exact problem that hurt them last season. Too many explosive runs with nobody around the football. So, keep this in mind heading into camp. It's not about flashy signings changing everything overnight. It's about a coordinator betting on technique over guesswork. Get this foundation right, and this defense stops being last season's punchline.